So, I have tried to make this video a few times, and every time I sit down to record it, I end up stopping. Because I don't know how to explain this in a way that doesn't either sound like I'm exaggerating or like I'm leaving out the part that actually matters. I think that's part of the problem with talking about dissociative identity disorder in general. Like, a lot of what it feels like doesn't really translate well. People can understand the concept, like, okay, memory gaps, different parts, dissociation, but the emotional reality of it, that's a bit harder to put into words. And for me, one of the biggest parts of that emotional reality is anger. Not the kind of anger people expect, though. Not explosive, not dramatic all the time, though sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's quiet. It's constant. It's this low level frustration that builds up over time until something small tips it over, and then suddenly it feels like way more than it should. And I honestly hate that feeling because from the outside, it doesn't really make sense. Even to me, sometimes it doesn't make sense. I'll get like overwhelmed or irritated or just completely shut down. And part of me is thinking or sitting there going, this isn't really a normal reaction, but it still feels real. And that disconnect between what I logically understand and what I actually feel is exhausting, to be honest. There's this part of DID that people don't really talk about, which is what it feels like to not have a continuous sense of being present in your own life. Like, you're there, but not always fully. Or you were there, but you don't remember it in a way that feels connected to you. And when that happens over and over again, it does something to you emotionally, because it's not just forgetting where you put your keys. It's bigger than that. It's realizing that time passed, but you weren't fully there for it. Or you were, but not in a way that you can access now. And I don't think people genuinely realize how disorienting that can actually be, or how frustrating it becomes, because you're constantly trying to catch up to your own life. You're constantly piecing things together, and even when everything looks fine on the outside, there's still this internal feeling of being out of sync. Like, you're slightly behind everything that's happening. And after a while, that starts to really wear on you. Kind of like how water carved out the Grand Canyon or whatever. And then there's the internal conflict. And I don't mean that in a way that sounds dramatic or like characters arguing in your head. It's not like that, at least not for me. It's more subtle. It's like emotional contradictions happening at the same time. Like, part of me wants to move forward, be productive, do normal things, And another part of me is completely overwhelmed or triggered or just not okay. And those two things don't exactly line up, but they're both real. So instead of feeling one clear emotion, it just feels like tension, like resistance, like trying to push through something that isn't visible but is very much there. And that's where a lot of the frustration comes from, because I can't just decide to feel one way and then have everything follow that. So it just doesn't work like that. There are also moments where I feel frustrated at myself in a way that I don't fully understand. And I have to be really careful talking about that, because I don't want it to come across like self-hatred ish. It's not exactly that. It's more like feeling disconnected from your own reactions. Like something happens and the response feels bigger or different than what you expected, and you're left trying to figure out why. And sometimes there isn't like a clear answer in the moment, and that lack of clarity also builds frustration, because I want to understand my own mind. I want to feel in control of how I respond to certain things. And when I don't, it's definitely destabilizing. And then there's the outside world, which is its own layer of frustration, because no matter how carefully I try to explain this, it usually doesn't land the way I mean it to. People either overcomplicate it or oversimplify it, or they compare it to things that just aren't fundamentally the same, or they just don't believe it in the way I'm experiencing it. And I get it to a certain extent, but it's not an easy thing to understand if you haven't lived it. But that doesn't make it any less real. And it's exhausting to constantly feel like you have to translate your experience into something more acceptable or understanding. Because in doing that, you lose parts of what it actually feels like. I think another part of the anger comes from how much effort it takes just to function. And I don't think that effort is visible to most people, even on days where I seem okay. There's usually a lot going on internally. Like, there's a lot of monitoring, like checking in with myself, trying to stay grounded, trying to stay present, trying to keep things from getting too overwhelming. And that takes energy, a lot of it too. So when something small goes wrong, it's usually not just that one thing. It's that I'm already running on limited capacity, and now there's one more thing to deal with. And sometimes that's enough to push everything over the edge, kind of like a domino effect. So there's also this kind of anger that comes from realizing why your brain works this way in the first place. And I'm not going to go into specifics, but DID doesn't just happen randomly. It's a response, it's a coping mechanism, it's something your brain develops to survive things that are just too much to process at the time. And there's something really complicated about living with the long-term effects of that, because on one hand, you understand that it helped you survive, but on the other hand, you're still dealing with it now. So in situations where you don't necessarily need that level of protection anymore, and that, for me, it just feels unfair. It can feel like you're dealing with consequences from something you didn't choose to have. And that feeling, whether it's directed at the past or the situation or just the reality of it, it can come out as anger. But I don't think the anger is the core issue. I think it's what happens when everything else just builds up. It's what happens when there's too much internal noise, too much stress, too much disconnect, too much effort with not enough space to process it. And it just has to go somewhere, you know? So it becomes out as irritation or a shutdown or frustration or just this underlying sense that something isn't quite right, even if you can't fully explain why. I am still learning how to deal with that, and I don't have a clean answer. Some days I can step back and recognize what's happening. I can pause, ground myself, give myself space, and it helps. And other days, I can't. And that's the part that's hard to admit, because I think there's pressure, even internally, to handle it perfectly, to always be aware, always in control, always managing it in the right way. But that's not exactly realistic, and pretending it is just adds more frustration on top of everything else. I think what I want people to understand, if they take anything from this, is that the anger isn't random. It's not just a personality trait. It's not me being difficult or dramatic or overreacting for no reason. It's connected to something deeper, to how my brain learned to function, how it handles stress, memory, emotion, and safety. And once you understand that, it doesn't make everything easier, but it does make it have more sense. And I think that matters, because there's already so much misunderstanding around DID, and a lot of it focuses on the more visible or interesting parts of it. But not enough attention is given to what it actually feels like to live with day to day. The quiet parts, the frustrating parts, the parts that don't translate well into short explanations or even clean narratives. I don't want this to sound hopeless, because it's not. There are moments of clarity. There are moments where things feel more stable, more connected, more manageable. And you have to remember that those moments matter, but they also exist alongside everything else, not instead of it, you know? I'm still figuring this out, still learning how to live with it in a way that doesn't turn everything inward. I'm still learning how to respond to the anger without letting it define me, and I don't think that's something that gets solved all at once. I think it's something you keep working through over time. But I wanted to talk about it honestly, because I don't see this part being talked about enough. And if someone out there is dealing with something similar, whether it's DID or just feeling disconnected from their own reactions or emotions even, I think it matters to hear that this exists. That it's real, and that you're not the only one experiencing it this way. And yeah, that's what it feels like for me. At least the best way I can explain it right now. So if you got anything out of this, let me know. You can leave your own experiences if you want, so that's up to you though. I don't want to pressure you into doing that, but I do want to pressure you into liking and subscribing. I'm kidding, but do it.